Well, for the latest, we now cross live to our US correspondent in New York, but today in Washington, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Thanks very much, for joining us. Looks like a lovely day for a president to be visiting a president.
And a lovely day, Peter, for them to have a conversation on almost everything that is part of the South Africa-US strategic dialogue. Things from insecurity around the world, be that Ukraine or northern Mozambique, issues of women's empowerment, as you heard the president talk there in his conversations with Vice President Kamala Harris, issues of climate adaptation and US financing, the developed world's responsibility for that migration from South Africa's dependence on fossil fuels for its energy, and of course that transition towards greater green energy use, things a discussion on food insecurity. President Ramaphosa also thanked President Biden for their support during the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa, one of the recipients of vaccine donations from the United States, appreciating Washington's support in terms of the TRIPS waiver for vaccines around the world, but of course also now pushing for continued support in South Africa and India's efforts to get waivers on things like therapeutics and diagnostics. And earlier today, President Ramaphosa, Peter, speaking to the Congressional Black Caucus at an event at the South African Embassy, and he raised the issue of Africa being allowed the space to choose its own partners, and that we should never again be a battleground for influence among global partners. What the president there is referring to is, of course, the Countering Russia Malign Activities Act, which passed the House of Representatives in March this year by an overwhelming majority, over 400 votes in favor of that legislation. It is now before the United States Senate. It hasn't, of course, yet been taken up, but South Africa is certainly lobbying their stakeholders here in the United States for that legislation not to pass. One imagines that that's going to be part of the conversation. And, when two presidents of this nature meet two democracies in the world, Peter, they are also likely to talk about some of the intractable issues, right? South Africa has always pushed for the embargo on Cuba to be lifted. South Africa, of course, is a good friend of the Palestinians, and they are certainly going to raise those issues. And I'm sure the issue of Ukraine and the divergent views around that are very much going to be part of the discussions that are ongoing right now in the Oval Office in the White House behind me.
Yeah, look, a really big agenda for them to get through. But I'm just getting a sense from the way that he's been received and escorted that he's being seen as a major partner for the United States.
This is not necessarily new. I mean, the last number of G7 meetings, Ramaphosa has always been, the representative of the African continent. First, I think, as chairperson of the African Union, and subsequently since as South Africa's president. So that he has been feted for a long time by the West. But these divisions persist, and what you are getting a sense from the United States, and certainly the way they have rolled out the red carpet for the South African delegation here, is that they want to bring them closer. I'll read you a little bit of what a senior U.S. official said on a call briefing journalists about this trip yesterday, that South Africa on Ukraine, as the conflict has evolved, we are eager to hear South Africa's perspective on how we reach a just conclusion to the conflict and what are the means to do that. So that is a shift in posture from a country that has been very much part of the war in many ways, in terms of the support for Ukraine, in terms of the weapons, the weapons cache that has been delivered to Ukraine, and now we are seeing some victories on the Eastern Front for Kyiv in that protracted conflict now with Russia. So the posture seems to be, hey, we want to hear divergent views, because I think there's a broad recognition that the longer this war goes on, the greater the impediments are going to be on things like food insecurity that has a direct impact on countries, some of the poorest countries, many of them in Africa, and of course the energy deficit that countries are grappling with, no less in a country like South Africa, where the transition to green technology, the adaptation and the financing for that adaptation is tied into that broader conversation of energy security. South Africa, of course, as you will remember, received this $8.5 billion pledge from some of the richest countries in the world, including about $1 billion of that 8.5 billion, from the United States. So the discussion is about the technicalities of how that money is going to be distributed, how it is going to be received in South Africa, what are the prescriptions around how that money is going to be used. Those finer details still have to be worked out. So these are very technical issues, and let's not forget they talked about the 600 companies from the United States that are invested in South Africa. South Africa, of course, seeking to broaden that relationship. They're seeking to broaden foreign direct investment from the United States in Africa. President Ramaphosa talking to the Black Congressional Caucus earlier saying we want black businesses to invest in South Africa, but businesses at large in the United States, because the growth trajectory in South Africa has not been what it should be in terms of the protracted issues that are facing South Africa, the inequality, poverty, and the very high unemployment rate in that country. So those are some of the real meat and potatoes discussions that are going to be going on here, including an appeal from South Africa for the lifting of U.S. tariffs on aluminium and steel exports from South Africa into the United States. It's been described as some of the low-hanging fruit here in terms of what can be done in the short term. The question is, what are those discussions going to deliver once President Ramaphosa emerges from the Oval Office and when he engages with the media later at his hotel later this afternoon here?
All right. I mean, all eyes there, certainly, and maybe a lot of expectations from South Africa in terms of what the president can bring home. You mentioned earlier Cuba, and I think President Mandela set the tone back then when he said, look, we'll be friends with you, but don't tell us who we must be friends with, in dealing with Ukraine. So the US, I'm guessing, is going to have to give and make some concessions to South Africa. But what does South Africa have to give up in terms of a position to come home with something in the bag?
I mean, that's a really great question. It's something I asked the Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor, yesterday when we chatted to her, Peter. I said, it feels like you're being wooed. It feels like you're being courted. What is the give, right? And, she was just talking about having a close bilateral relationship, that economic development and, Agenda 2063 of the African Union, which is a center pillar, a peg of South Africa's foreign policy, Africa's foreign policy. But this is also from South Africa. South Africa has always sought mutual respect, right? They do not see themselves necessarily as a smaller country that can be dictated to. South Africa believes that its sovereignty must be respected, and they use the example of the Countering Russia Malign Activities Act. They want that to go away because they believe that that impugns the sovereign relations that African countries might seek to have with countries like Russia, with countries like China, who are adversaries of the United States. So it's unclear what the United States in particular wants from South Africa, but there was an example in a discussion between Naledi Pandor and Jendai Fraser, a former ambassador to South Africa, at the Council on Foreign Relations earlier this week, where she said, your tone was sharp with the United States when they invaded Iraq. Your tone is not as sharp now that Russia is doing that. So there's a courting in terms of South Africa's role in the African continent in terms of authoritarian influence. We've seen a backsliding in terms of democracy. And if you look at the new US strategy for Africa, that is a key peg: democracy, open societies, that kind of thing, which South Africa is exemplary in terms of the African continent. So they want South Africa's goodwill in terms of what the United States is trying to seek in terms of that new strategy. But, the details are very, very important here, Peter. The details are always very important. South Africa is not just going to give the cake away if they disagree with the United States here.
All right, so a lot to be discussed. We wait with bated breath to hear what comes out of it. What else can we expect from this trip? Is there anything else that's on the schedule?
Yeah, so let me just give you a quick rundown. He met Kamala Harris this morning. He then had a meeting with the Black Congressional Caucus at the embassy. There were also anti-apartheid veterans from the United States that were part of that discussion, Peter. He then came to the White House. He's in the White House behind me right now. He's going to do a media briefing with South African media later this afternoon. And then he's hosting a dinner for members of the Senate and members of Congress at the South African embassy. It's a closed dinner, and that kind of concludes the official program here. Of course, the president departs later Saturday, that's tomorrow, for the United Kingdom, where he'll be attending the funeral of the late Queen Elizabeth II. And of course, we understand that King Charles III will be hosting a dinner on Sunday night, we believe, in London for visiting heads of state. So President Ramaphosa will certainly be part of that. But we're almost at the conclusion here of a very, very busy day. But we look forward to engaging with the President later in terms of some of the outcomes of his engagement with President Biden.
All right, Sherwin, hopefully we'll catch up with you again a little bit later on, just in case there's more news. But for now, thanks for that update.